We had a very important task to discuss the pharmacological therapy and the safety issues. And as you know, with the introduction of newer drugs and with knowing the problems with Coumadin and heparin, such as heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, safety issues with bleeding with both of these drugs and so forth, and the issues which have been somewhat eluded with the newer drugs, such as the myocardial signal with dabigatran, also bleeding issues with some of these newer agents, and as said before that we have only little experience with newer drugs, and with time we probably will learn more. We had a very lively discussion. We had about 15 members in the panel, with the former FDA Director of Coagulation, Dr. Steve Fred, who was quite critical of some of the issues and required explanation and information. So we will probably summarize these and put it on our web. But I just like to highlight some of the points which were discussed in our group. The first thing the group identified is to really define the objective of the group's tasks in terms of identifying issues. What are the real issues with both the conventional drugs such as the Coumadin, heparin, aspirin, and so forth, and what are the issues with the newer drugs and how the safety issues compare with the older and newer drugs. The group also indicated that we should have a white paper or a consensus document or some web statements for comments on the discussions. And of course, we have taken some points from the audience today too in that regard. Some of the questions were asked regarding the indiscriminate inhibition of thrombin completely, where thrombin plays a very important key role in regulatory processes in platelet function and activated protein C activity and so forth. Then the group also identified the issue related with bleeding and some other problems with newer pharmacologic agents. And mostly these discussions were focused on newer oral anticoagulants. The data then was discussed in terms of the use of these agents in DVT prophylaxis in orthopedic settings for which these drugs were initially approved, rivaroxaban and dabigatran and apixaban in Europe now. And then the DVT treatment, and of course the superiority of the drug, these drugs in atrial fibrillation, which has been evident with some of the newer trials, such as Aristotle and the RELY trial. As said by Dr. Goldhaber, in DVT prophylaxis, the group did not find any obvious advantages in non-inferiority with newer agents, and these drugs are at par, and there are some questions regarding their compliance and efficacy. The DVT treatment issue is also somewhat questionable right now. We need more data, and we have to wait for that, but some statements were made in terms of the newer trials, such as Magellan trial, where the medical patients were not seen to be benefited as much as with the conventional agents. Also, the discussion regarding the use of these drugs, especially the newer drugs, in different age groups in terms of the pediatric dosing, elderly dosing, gender differences, and other population-based differences. And we were reminded that, of course, the FDA has already instituted mechanisms, at least for the pediatric patients and the dosing there. Unfortunately, the dosing of all these agents is a fixed dosing from 5 milligram to 150 milligram, as you saw in Dr. Goldhaber's slide. The off-label use of new drugs, and of course, it was reminded that at this time it is not really recommended to have off-label using these drugs, and then the post-marketing surveillance and having the information available on the drug safety was important. After giving this discussion in the yesterday's close group of our invited participants, there were two other issues which were brought, both of these by Dr. Murley, and one was regarding the monitoring of these drugs. Can we develop a method or have a method for monitoring these drugs to identify their risk of bleeding or to switch them to other drugs, or after surgery, how can we manage these? And then the other question was that in case of bleeding, how do we manage bleeding? And of course, we did not have time to discuss this. In the case of heparins and the oral anticoagulants, we do have antidotes, but in the case of the newer anticoagulants, we do not. We have newer agents, we have preclinical data on some of the approaches, but we do not have a approach to neutralize these drugs. So there have been some papers on giving factor 7A, prothrombin complexes, and so forth. I'm out of time by 5 minutes, but I think we have discussion points. So let me just take 2 more minutes here. The group finally felt that with the introduction of new drugs, we have new approaches and newer choices for physicians to treat thromboembolic disease and atrial fibrillation. So that is a good thing. The group felt that NATF can play a very important role in addressing some of the issues which have been identified. And of course, your input will be very welcome in the form of a discussion. I'd like to have at least some discussion on the safety of these issues and some of the questions which were asked on the myocardial signal, on the bleeding. And the group, in fact, brought out the fact that the Japanese government has an advisory on the use of these drugs in elderly patients before the 5 reported deaths with dabigatran. And of course, there were some issues related with the use of definition of bleeding with rivaroxaban in the clinical trials, which FDA has closely scrutinized. The question of transitioning patients to newer agents and what guidelines are those was also discussed. And of course, these guidelines have to be addressed at ACCP and other organizations. And the group felt that NATF and like organizations should interact with FDA, US Pharmacopoeia, and other regulatory bodies to identify additional issues and some guidelines how to deal with these. And then the role of industry in providing safety data and subset analysis was also discussed. So in summary, the group felt that we should at least identify some of the important points which were discussed and then proceed with a plan. And the first plan is to have on our website a list of these issues and the input from our membership and also the Scientific and Education Committee, and then on a periodic basis update this website and report to you until next year on additional safety of the conventional drugs as well as the newer oral anticoagulants. And with that, I'll be very happy to take any questions from the audience.
I'm Mark Schwarber. Past 2 weeks, I saw 2 patients with GI bleeding secondary to Pradaxa. And what would you recommend to do besides transfusing them with blood?
Yeah, the question is, if I understood, is GI bleed with Pradaxa? Yes. And what recommendation one can make in managing it?
Well, from a more policy standpoint.
From a policy standpoint, is stop the drug. And but in the case of GI bleed, of course, is this related to the pharmacology of the Pradaxa, or is it related to the overall inhibition of thrombin? So that may be true for Coumadin. From a clinician standpoint, what do you think if there is a policy has to be implemented?
Well, I think with any of these medications, it comes down to patient selection. We can do our best to make sure that we're finding patients that are where the drug works well and the patient works well with the drug. But sometimes you can do everything to screen patients for a risk of bleeding and they still have a bleeding complication. But I think one of the things we did at Partners was actually to come up with a set of guidelines for use of dabigatran in the prevention of stroke for non-valvular AF, and we outline patient groups that are at higher risk for bleeding. And I think that's a great clinical tool. And for any of you interested in looking at that, the results of those guidelines will be published in Critical Pathways in Cardiology within the next couple of months. Any other questions?
I have a comment/request in that monitoring, we're not talking about monitoring. Warfarin is monitored. Monthly, the patients come in and get tested. What we're talking about is having an assay that can tell you the anticoagulation status of the patient. So using the word monitoring, that's a four-letter word to the pharma now. So if you can change your wording to say evaluation of the anticoagulation status or something, monitoring means something completely different.
So what word would you propose?
Again, they're measuring their anticoagulation status. That's what we need the assays for. Because, and going back to Dr. Goldhaber's point, a lot of the people who are on warfarin are elderly, and it is a social event to come to the anticoagulation clinic. They see the same people, blah, blah, blah. But these new drugs, for people who are traveling, whatever, just so that if they walk into an emergency room, there is an assay that can evaluate their anticoagulation status. Thank you.
I think it's a very important point which you just brought in. Thank you very much for suggesting this, to use the statement or word assessment of anticoagulant status of a given patient rather than monitoring. Because monitoring can have several connotations. You can monitor the drug concentration, which has no meanings to the anticoagulant state, as with warfarin we see and many other drugs. And these drugs are single target drugs. And having studied these drugs for some time, I see that their anticoagulant effects or assessment of the anticoagulant status of the patient, in a cancer patient, a similar dose of Reduxa will produce a different effect than a patient with antiphospholipid syndrome or with acute coronary syndrome, or a liver disease patient. So the differentiation of the term monitoring with the assessment of anticoagulants is a very good suggestion. Thank you.
And maybe last question from John.
Actually, I was hoping I could make a very brief comment about the Japanese reports. I think it's important to know that those reports come from patients in whom dabigatran was not appropriately used. So I think that's a key point of clarification. With respect to the management of bleeding, the best way to deal with bleeding is to avoid it in the first place. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that if we use dabigatran, we're going to reduce bleeding. The other aspect is that the drug half-life being short, the drug does wear off rapidly. And I think that's our best weapon for bleeding. Within 12 hours, drug levels are down to half of the level, steady state level. So I think that's going to be very valuable.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akbar. Thank you for your comment. Thank you.